I'm Summer Harlow. I'm from the University of Houston, and I'm presenting research today with a colleague who's also another former Longhorn, Monica Chadha, who's an assistant professor at Arizona State University. She is not with us today, but she's here in spirit. And a big thank you to Rosenthal and Amy, of course. Coming back to ISOJ is like coming home, so it's so good to be here. But what I want to talk to you all about today is the potential sustainability of online news. And I think that this really kind of fits well with what Daryl was just talking about. And when I say sustainability of online news, I'm not just talking about sustainability or online community news. I'm not just talking about sustainability in terms of financial sustainability, but also sustainability in terms of the ability of these online community news sites to maintain a mission of public-spirited journalism, to maintain a mission geared at civic engagement. And I'll talk a little bit more about all of that briefly. But just kind of to set the stage, right? We've all been talking today about sustainability, what's going to happen in the future. And with community news, the problem is not just financial sustainability, right? So as Daryl mentioned, we're seeing that mainstream newspapers are cutting back on their local coverage. There's just not as much of it, and this is a problem for democracy, right? If we're talking about community news, and that community news is actually there to provide the information that citizens need in order to participate fully in civic and democratic and political life, then this local news becomes all the more important. But not only are community news sites dealing with this question of financial sustainability, they're also dealing with the question of identity, right? Our definition of community has changed. Community is no longer bounded by geographic boundaries and limits, right? We've got communities of interest that are global. So even as the community or the definition of community is changing, what's not changing is that commitment to public-spirited content, or content that allows citizens to fully participate in society. And so when we think about community journalism then, and online community news, what I'm talking about is news where the journalists are part of the community, that they are advocating for their communities. They are not just covering their communities, they're participating in the communities. They're community cheerleaders. And what, in particular, there's 4 elements that, for the purposes of my research, that it's important to understand that we think constitute this civic engagement criterion of community journalism. And we're calling it public-spirited content. And this revolves around the community cheerleading, number 1. Number 2, providing mobilizing information, which is also giving time, date, place, contact information so that people can get involved in whatever's going on in their communities. It's advocating on behalf of the community and for the community. And then 4th, it is calls to action. So going beyond providing the mobilizing information and beyond advocating and actually encouraging the public to get involved, telling them that that they should get involved. So we wondered, though, within this, when we're thinking about what is community news, what is online community news, and how is it financially sustainable, can the entrepreneurial factors of financial, fundraising, business models, all of that, how is that going to fit in with this idea of public-spirited content and serving this civic engagement criterion? So we wanted to look at the relationships between revenue and inclusion of public-spirited content, ownership and public-spirited content, and a site's mission in public-spirited content. And then additionally, we wanted to look at interactive features because, of course, interactivity, participation, that is fundamental to what the community news mission is, right? So how do we do this? We started off, Michelle McClellan does a survey every year of online, local, independent news sites. And we took the top 5 revenue earning sites, the mid 5 revenue earning sites, and the lowest 5 revenue earning sites. And then we conducted a content analysis of 2 weeks worth of content from those 15 different sites. And we looked at 680 stories total. Just really quickly, about half of the content came from for-profit sites, half from nonprofit sites, and most came from the mid-revenue earning sites. But when we look at the public-spirited content, this is where things start to get interesting. And we see that in general, these community news sites are not actually really following this civic engagement criterion. Most stories did not include public-spirited content. And when we did see public-spirited content, the majority of it was mobilizing information and community cheerleading. And that was somewhat of a surprise, right? So if we think about community journalists supposed to be in the communities, participating in the communities, we would think that we might actually see more calls to action and more advocating. When we look at revenue, what we see is that the advertising-reliant sites included less public-spirited content than the more alternative-funded sites in terms of they're funded by foundations or grants or by government funding instead of advertising. And to us, what this means is that the advertising-reliant sites actually adhere to a more traditional form of journalism, right? The ideas of objectivity, neutrality, distance from the community, or a distance from the story, but of course, distance from the story actually translates to distance from the community. Whereas the non-advertising sites, those tended to follow more of this idea of journalism through an advocacy lens, right? That they actually did see themselves not just as covering a community, but actually part of that community, participating in that community. And then looking at amount of income, right? Because remember, we compared the high, the mid, and the low income earners. And what we see is that the low income earners actually included more calls to action and more advocacy stories than did the higher earning sites. It's also worth noting that the higher earning sites included more of the community cheerleading content. Maybe this is because the community cheerleading content is seen as more positive, more benign, and so attracts more readers, therefore potentially attracts more advertisers and more revenue. Oh my goodness. But also, if you think about advocacy and call to action stories, those could be considered maybe a little bit more controversial, and so maybe therefore not as appealing to advertisers. But this warrants then a caution for community journalism practitioners, that we want to be sure that they don't just completely abandon the calls to action and the advocacy stories simply because they might not be earning as much revenue as the more revenue-friendly cheerleading stories. And then ownership. Again, when we look at the content across for-profit or nonprofit, more of the community cheerleading content was in the nonprofit sites, and more mobilizing information was in the for-profit sites. And I think this is because of our definition of mobilizing information. It could have included time, date, place to participate in anything. And what we saw is that most of the time, rather than a political event or a protest or something, it tended to be a grand opening of a business. So it makes sense then that that would be in a for-profit site. And then mission, the investigative watchdog sites and the demographic community, or the sites that served a particular demographic community, those had more of the public-spirited content. Which means that the general news sites had less public-spirited content. They're neglecting it. So this raises questions then about the extent to which we can actually consider these more general news sites to truly be online community sites, or rather, perhaps they're actually just sites in a community writing about that community, but not really writing for and on behalf of that community. And then lastly, interactive features. There's 8 features in total that we looked at based off of the Michelle's List survey. And what we see is that ownership makes a difference. The nonprofit sites included much more of these interactive features. They had more freedom, a little bit more flexibility perhaps. Same with the sites funded by foundations and university grants. So what this means then, and then of course, the low-income earning sites had fewer. So what ultimately then this is telling us, just kind of rushing through this, we're starting to see the relationship between funding and innovation. That the sites that don't have to worry as much about offending advertisers perhaps have more flexibility. They can include more interactive features that can open up the gates to more user participation. But still, even though we see that it's these alternative funded sites and these nonprofit sites that are the ones doing the more interactivity, they're also the ones who are earning more money. The low-income earning sites, they don't have the resources to have those interactive features. So the main takeaway then is that the sustainability of online community news sites, and of course sustainability, again, not just in terms of finance, but also in terms of their commitment to that civic engagement criterion, that public-spirited mission, it seems to be tied to new alternative ways of thinking about financing and ownership. So thank you very much.